Hello, welcome to Books in the World, our production in association with the Cape Cod Writers Center. My name is Richard Bodertha and I'll be your host today. Our guest today is a poet, Judith Askew, here from the Cape. Her latest book, the second book of poetry, is On the Loose, that is published by Bass River Press right nearby. Hello, Judith.
Hello, Richard.
I was reading the Boston Globe not too long ago, and there was an interview by the poet laureate, or with the poet laureate, and his name is Juan Felipe Herrera. And he mentioned a little bit about his love for words, and of course, being a poet, I'm sure that you certainly started with a love for words. He said, "We are living in an ocean of beautiful words. This is the community of poets. And I want to take a nice swim and come out soaked in their wisdom." Is that, this ocean of words, is that how a poet really begins to fall in love with poetry?
Well, I think it's a very important aspect of poetry is, for me, it's love of words, love of language, the sounds of words, the rhythm in the language, the cadence. I don't know if it's where you begin. I think I began more in trying to sort out kind of mixed emotions and not understanding what was going on. But I think I've always loved language and really became more aware of that love as I continued writing. I started out in journalism, actually. Actually, one of the first things I did was act as a writer, as a journalist for the Barnstable Patriot many years ago when I was in college, a couple of summers when I was in college. So it isn't that I came to poetry when I was, you know, a teenager or very young, other than to read it, of course.
Well, even growing up in schools, I don't know how they teach poetry now, but a lot of people sort of got stymied with acquiring a love for poetry because in school we were always taught to break down the theme, and it seemed very analytical, whereas really sometimes a poem is really not meant to be understood or understood on many different levels.
And probably it's a poem because it doesn't fit into a linear way of thinking, journalism or an essay or a novel. It touches on mystery a little bit more, I think.
And what do you mean by that mystery? I do know that one of the poems that you have in your book, the caption by Wallace Stevens, actually, who said, "The greatest poverty is not living in a physical world." Now that relates to mystery a little bit. The love of the physical world, is that something that you've always had?
Yes, and I think that's common among poets. There's a lot of poetry that's inspired and about nature, which is our physical world. And I think that's really an important element. And that's some of the mystery, and also the mystery of interactions with people. We don't always know exactly what's going on, and we don't always know exactly what's going on in a poem, although I like to write poems that are accessible and are understood.
By that, do you mean accessible? I know I was talking to you earlier. Robert Pinsky, a long time ago, said, "The more I read poetry, the less literary my poetry becomes." Why don't you tell us a little bit about your style of writing? Does it match your speaking? Is the poem that you like best conversational? Or?
Well, I tend to write in a conversational tone, many of my poems, but not all of them. Once in a while I get a little bit more rhetorical, a little more elevated, but pretty much I like to include common expressions. And sometimes I like to think about, recently I've been thinking about a couple of expressions, making ends meet and being at loose ends. The expression struck me as kind of odd. What did my mother mean when she said those things? So I've written some poems recently, or a poem about each of those things. And there's a poem in the book called Adages, which includes a lot of the expressions that my mother used. I think parents use them when children are growing up, these shorthand expressions. They're, what is the word? They're
well, cliches, but
cliches,
at some point a cliche expressed a real legitimate truth in an original way. But over the years, of course, it becomes not hackneyed, but I understand where you're going with it. You want to take a new twist on an old cliche.
Yeah.
Now, Adages, is that one of your favorite poems?
Yes, it was a poem that I thought about for quite a long time, because I had these expressions, these adages from my mother, and I wanted to kind of put them together into a poem.
Now, where did you grow up? You mentioned your mother. Where?
I did grow up on the Cape.
Oh, you did?
I grew up actually on Ocean Street in Hyannis, right across from the harbor, which was incredibly different than it is now. In fact, the house where I grew up isn't there anymore. So the ocean and water is very much a part of my experience in my poetry as well.
Where did your life take you after your early years here on the Cape?
My friend Sandy and I came home from college to the Cape and said, well, now what do? We didn't know we were supposed to be finding husbands when we were in college. So we went to Manhattan and we spent 2.5 years. I spent 2.5 years, then came back to Boston, went back to school, got a master's, taught school, found myself to be single when most of my friends were now getting married and having children. And so I moved to San Francisco and found myself living there for 30 years, which was a surprise. It wasn't, my life is kind of haphazard.
Well, you said earlier that one of your favorite words is serendipity, so not only in your poetry, but in your life, I suppose, too.
Yes, actually, it's, I haven't had a need for a great deal of security, and I also really, I like the idea of freedom, of being free, and so I've been kind of fortunate in that respect. And I did marry later in life out on the West Coast, and then lost my husband and moved back to the Cape because my parents were here and were aging, so I came back for them.
Now, one of the first projects that you did, and I believe it was in the late 70s, was a anthology called Out of the Cellar, a poetry anthology. Now, is this more, well, you explain to me, Elegy for Anne Sexton, is it a book about woman's poetry? Or is it?
Well, it really is.
It's an anthology. You didn't write it.
It's an anthology. I and another woman in this women's group put together some of the poems we have been reading and working on in this women's group. And at that time, it really was the beginning of the women's movement and women writing more, women being published more. I mean, I went through college and graduate school and scarcely met a woman writer. I mean, we were reading all the men. So, and that's had an influence on me because because I want to share the perspective, the understanding of a woman, from things from a woman's perspective. So that's what that Out of the Cellar, the anthology is. That group of women, we met at something called the Intersection of the Arts in San Francisco, and it was really thrilling for all of us because we had been writing poetry but not really talking about it very much, and no one really knew that we were doing it. We didn't think of ourselves particularly as poets, but there were some wonderful, wonderful poems, and so Nona, another woman in the group, and I put them together.
Well, San Francisco must have been a very active arts community, and certainly poetry. Yeah. And now you have one of your poems you stated was one of your favorite, Caesar, musing after meeting Cleopatra. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis for that? Is it a historical? Obviously, it's got a historical context, but how did that come to rise?
Well, I was in a Great Books group, and we had been reading Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. And in the discussion, the men and the women had very different understandings of Cleopatra. So I was kind of inspired to go home and write a poem. I'm not sure that exactly that idea came out, but I did have, because I just read the play, I had some background, knew a little bit about Cleopatra. So.
Well, she was quite a symbol. I know you mentioned early on in San Francisco there was a lot going on. I mean, there was a social upheaval, actually, with the women's movement, the civil rights movement. I think you were probably involved in all that. Do you mind if I read one poem, a section of one poem here? It starts, it's Happy Birthday, that's the name of it. It starts with the birth control pill. But I'm going to skip that part. But there is a romantic interlude here that I think kind of sums up a little bit about what you might have been going through. But the body knew, in the hands of a prince, a slumbering beauty had been awakened. 100 muttering voices had been driven off. The voices of disgrace had slinked away. It was the end of the nun's wicked care of teen mothers, the end of fathers waving shotguns. It was the beginning of mothers' deepening envy. New concepts sprang up like fertile weeds. Planned Parenthood, sex education, co-ed dorms, and oral contraceptives. We knew we were trial balloons sent up in a freakish windstorm. So that's very apt of what was going on at that point. Can you tell us a little bit about the conditions of your writing process? I mean, where do you write? Do you always write in the same spot, or do you have a study? Are you a morning person, or are you more involved in inspiration and letting when the spirit moves you?
I don't have any regular pattern. I do have a place, a study, but now I have a laptop computer, so I write in different places. I have a chair that was my grandmother's that I often sit in. She actually wrote poetry, so I think that was where I maybe got the first idea about poetry. But when I first began writing poetry, I would try to sort out. I didn't understand things, and I would try to sort something out in my mind or in my heart. And sometimes I would write a poem, and it would be a few months before I would understand what I had actually been writing about. That's not the case so much anymore, because I probably understand people in life a little better now. So I'm inspired in different ways.
Are there certain poets that have inspired you, or given you background, or have helped you, or just by reading them, not necessarily as a mentor or anything like that? But.
Well, I have been to groups, workshops, weekends, and I also read a lot of poetry. I think early on I liked Robert Frost because of his New England landscape and his irony and all his imagery, and very concise, his language. I like Billy Collins because of his humor. And he takes expressions. One of his poems is questions about angels, and he starts with how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and then he goes from there wondering about, well, what do the angels do all the time in eternity? It's a long time. So it's a very humorous poem, and his imagination is very rich and fertile.
He was a poet laureate for a while,
He
wasn't
was,
he?
yes. Yeah.
Do you ever start out with a theme that you want to impart? I know this is getting very, we're going down the academic road, and I'm not sure that's really the way you work, starting with a theme. But has that ever, what is really the underlining pull that grabs you and pulls you into writing this poem?
Well, actually, especially these days, I'm, concerned politically, but political poems are very difficult to write. I tried to write one starting with Donald Trump's airplane, his personal plane. But I'm afraid I just became angry in the poem, so.
Well, speaking of politics, I know John Kennedy at his inauguration had a poetry reading. Robert Frost, in fact. Bill Clinton did both times, I think, and Obama did. Certainly, it's a time for poetry to bring everybody and all our differences together. Not every president chooses to have a poem read. I'm not sure if President Trump did or not, but I want to get in a little bit to some of the prizes that you've won.
Oh, yeah, that's something that happened last year that was surprising and wonderful.
Now, what prize specifically did you win?
Well, there was one that was judged by Marge Piercy, Joe Guevara annual prize, which I won first prize for.
Is that Talk About the Weather? Is that the name?
Talk About the Weather,
yeah.
right.
And who is Joe, and why was the prize named after him?
Joe had been a poet here on the Cape for many years, had been involved at Cape Cod Community College and the Cultural Center. He ran an evening of poetry with Barry Hellman, the two of them. And he just mentored a lot of poets and was a wonderful poet. And so, we miss him. Yeah.
And the judge for that poetry contest was Tony.
No, that was for the contest for this book.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That was very exciting. The
On
Cultural
the Loose
Center
won a prize. Can you tell us about the prize that it won?
Well, it was the publication of this book.
Right.
And the Cultural Center in South Yarmouth, Lauren Wolk, who's the director, she writes poetry herself. She knows a lot of poets. And they had talked about we need a press on the Cape. There are many poets, many wonderful poets on the Cape. So they were able to raise some funding, and they started Bass River Press, which is how this book was published, and then sent some manuscripts to Tony Hoagland, who selected this manuscript. So I was thrilled to be published and to be the first publication of the Bass River Press.
Oh, it is actually the very first
first publication of the new press. Yeah.
Wow. And when did it come out? Last year?
It came out in April, so it's been out for about 10 months now. Yeah.
Yeah. Now the poem that won the prize that we were speaking about, Joe Guevara Memorial, it was the Outermost Cape contest.
Yeah.
Sponsored by Woman. What's the organization?
WCOI. It's a radio station in Provincetown.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
radio station in
All
Provincetown.
right.
And that's an annual contest.
What is Talk About the Weather about? Obviously, it's about the weather, but
well, it's
I don't mean to be so.
You know, this is the when you ask about, you know, how do I get started on a poem or where do poems come from? I kept looking at these in California, the weather it used to be so stable that there weren't very many weather reports. You know, it's just another day in paradise. So, so when I came back to Massachusetts and these endless weather reports on television just irritated me. So that was why where this poem came from, trying to...
Oh, yeah, I think in the poem Talk About the Weather, you even use that line. In California, no one talks about the weather, just another day in paradise.
Yeah.
On Cape Cod, wait a minute, it'll change. And then I think the final part of the poem, you say, bring on the real thing. Quiet, portending birds, light-filled skies, filtered to opalescence, spastic trees, all in an uproar, a god spinning handwriting across a night sky. I thought that was a very nice image.
Yeah.
The branches scrawling a god's handwriting across the sky. What about imagery? How does that factor into your poetry?
Imagery is something that I have to kind of bring in consciously because it's not my natural go-to way of writing a poem, and yet it's very important in poetry. So that was what I was doing there at the end, was bringing in.
Now those branches in that sort of tableau that we have of the sprawling branches or handwriting across the sky, can you get into the metaphor and the similes that you use? Or first off, for some of the uninitiated, including myself, the difference between a metaphor and a simile.
They're both comparisons, two things being compared. With a simile, you use the word like, and with a metaphor, you don't use the word like. But they're basically doing the same thing. They're making a comparison. And I think metaphors contribute to the mystery of poetry. I have to admit,
and how
with
is
those,
that? Because it hints at something sort of obliquely and kind of.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
The spastic trees is a little bit. Tony Hoagland, there's a poem, I like his poetry a lot, and there's a poem of his where he refers to the seasick trees, which I think about a lot because I live in a condo with sliding glass doors, and these trees are always blowing out there, and I think of Tony's seasick trees, so my trees became spastic.
Seasick trees, yeah. Very, very good, very apt, yep. Okay. Now, most of your poetry is free verse. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. Although often I'll write in. I give it some form, but it's not. I'm not very meticulous or disciplined about form. I don't count syllables and so on, but lines seem to break sometimes in some poems in two-line stanzas or three-line stanzas, but not always.
So it's not a real formal writing.
No.
Did you start out, I mean, if you emulated Robert Frost at one point, I mean, those are very standard, and there's a form.
Yes, I think trying to be concise, but I didn't rhyme. Frost uses a lot of rhyme, which we don't use so much now.
Sometimes, oddly, you're given more freedom by constraint. I mean, the form, if it's if you feel it's kind of counterintuitive, I suppose, but if you feel constrained, you're also more free at some point too to write.
Yeah.
What's next for you? Do you have Something else you're working on, or a project that you're working on? Do you have
I'm
a poetry
trying
blog?
to.
Do you have a poetry blog, for instance?
No, I have a homepage, but I don't have a blog. I have a lot of poems. I'm trying to pull together another manuscript, and I send poems out to be published. But
To different magazines? And,
yes, that's
now,
pretty tedious.
if people would like to order a copy of On the Loose or any of your other books, how best do you recommend they do that?
Well, if they're used to going to Amazon, they can go to Amazon. My Out of the Cellar is, you can get that through my website, which is Judith Askew or judyaskew.com.
Is that Judy with an I or a Y?
With a Y.
With a Y, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Or some of the bookstores on the Cape have it. The Cultural Center has it.
The Cultural Center here on the Cape? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. I really enjoyed your poetry. I thought the
thank
imagery
you.
was especially
Thank you.
striking. I really,
Thank you.
really like that. I hope we impressed our viewers with that as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I've
you.
enjoyed talking to you.
Great. Good luck in the future.
Thank
Keep
you.
writing.